My question to the candidates is what are your party's proposals for the proper enforcement of the existing MPAs?
It's a definition, exactly what we want from that. It's a bit like, what does sustainability mean? Absolutely no difficulty with marine protected areas, but you can't take a blanket approach. The seabed is like the land. It has sand, it has rocks, it has areas, and the reality is, in some aspects, it has to be cultivated. Some activity actually helps the stock. Quite interesting when you look at some of the emotive pictures of marine protected areas where they're trying to protect the coral and habitat. How can it be there if there's been so much damage? But yet there's no issues around the marine protected areas at all. But it shouldn't be abandoned on fishing. There are sustainable fishing, line fishing, static gear. So we need to be quite clear, but it comes back to fully understanding what the objective is. You can't keep throwing things that don't get the buy-in from the people who are making a livelihood from that. There has to be that balance. So yeah, there's a place for everything, but let's not just make it a tick box exercise. And I think that has been the problem, where they've allocated places that really are not appropriate, because there's a lot of activity there in terms of fishing, but not so much the ecology can cope with that.
You said the sea has to be harvested. Why?
Well, the activity itself, it's the seabed. I'm not a scientist, but the seabed can resemble the onshore, where you've got rocks, you've got sand, you've got fertile ground. Now, some activities, if the activity of fishermen over the generations had created so much damage, they wouldn't be going back there. It would be wiped out.
Yeah, but so, you don't have to harvest it. You could just leave it alone, right?
Well, it's like anything else. You leave it alone, it becomes barren. Yes, you could say if you didn't plough the fields, it would grow, but you wouldn't get anything from it. So it's getting that balance right.
Okay, you're frowning, Claudia. What's your answer to the question?
Well, first of all, I would just politely disagree with John that it's not a case of it being barren if it's not harvested. I mean, in the same way that there are areas of land which are being rewilded, and there are areas where there are ecological networks by land and sea. And I think it's important to recognise that the marine protected areas, to go directly to the question, do not have the management to start with in many cases, which is appropriate, and then and has buy-in and discussion from those who are involved, and then also the enforcement. We have 2 boats only in Scotland. Now, I know that money is short and there are massive challenges in so many ways, but if there was the possibility of the satellite on all boats, even small boats, then that would cause, there would be less problems of the dreadful situations that happen. I mean, Lamlash Bay is an example of somewhere which I went to with Coast a few years ago, and that was a no-take zone where things were in a very bad way because of the dredging and the overfishing, and then the recovery is very quick. But we have to acknowledge that we need robust protection for our inshore seas, and that some of the ways that things are fished, especially where there are very precious marine features such as flame shells, are just simply not appropriate, and we now recognise that. So we need to look to sustainable futures such as static gear and other ways like hand diving of scallops and different things that can support communities but which don't damage our seas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Harriet, for the Conservatives, what's your answer to the question? How do we, our marine protected areas, paper parks, can we make them better?
We can certainly make them better. Everything can always be made better. The idea of them being paper parks, I appreciate, which is why we're pushing to get them enhanced, and whether that's to reduce the current number and actually have them more focused on areas that really need protection, rather than sort of have them spread out, because that will allow larger areas where biodiversity can congregate and build together. You need areas of disturbance in order for ecosystems to grow, and you need that in order to allow climax species to come in. So if we can have special areas which are actually really targeted in areas where conservation is, one, possible, two, needed, and three, where actually you're pulling in the different species which already exist, that will really make a big difference in actually moving these to be something that are more important. On top of that, and which I was coming back to in my opening statement, we need to actually be assessing the quality of the marine protection areas more often. There's no point having them if we can't actually state what the condition they're in, if they're getting better, if they're getting worse, and what we can do about it. And then thirdly, monitoring. Of course, there needs to be more protections. I mean, as Phil said in his introduction, the fishing in MPAs and things like that, that can't be going on. And that's the point. We need to make sure that we can ensure, whether that's by more local monitoring or more enforcement or harsher enforcement, that people are not going to use the marine protection areas for anything other than protecting marine life. And the rest of the seas then can be sustainably fished in a different way, but leaving these areas for their purpose of regeneration and rebuilding the seas.
I can't disagree with a lot of what Harriet has said there, and also Claudia. It's clear that, you know, tracking devices are needed in order to make sure that, you know, we're not seeing this, you know, this harm in these marine protected areas. And it reminds me somewhat of wild land areas, which were introduced by the Scottish Government a number of years ago, which I did a lot of work in this area, and there has been a lot of enforcement in protecting wild land areas, but there doesn't seem to be a parity of esteem when it comes to the seabed. Clearly, you know, the marine protected areas are not seeing the same level of enforcement as we're seeing for wild land areas. You know, and there should be the same level of enforcement. It doesn't appear that MPAs have any teeth behind them at the moment at all, and that needs to change. And I would say that it probably is, you know, a paper exercise at this point in time.
Thank you very much. So I think I'll go to Paul next. Inevitably, Paul, because you've been in government for years, a lot of these things are going to end up on your plate. You know, and part, of course, the background to this is lots of evidence that the marine protected areas aren't really working in protecting marine areas. I hesitate to mention the ferret again, but we reported in July 2020, actually I don't hesitate to mention it again, that a Scottish Government study had found that less than 1% of the trawling and dredging around Scotland's coast had been covered by controls in marine protected areas. And the researchers paid by the Scottish Government warned in which the way in which marine protected areas have been presented as claiming to provide protection was misleading. So is that fair? Are you going to do better on marine protected areas if you get elected again?
I suppose the first thing to do, Rob, is to acknowledge there's a problem to be fixed, and there is clearly a need to strengthen monitoring, and that monitoring is key to enforcement. So the remote electronic monitoring that I mentioned very briefly earlier on is, I think, going to be critically, or it sort of touches on some of the points that have been made by Sue and other colleagues before, around what we actually do to police this, rather than just have a sort of paper designation, as has been dubbed. So in terms of actual measures, there's certainly, I think, plans for around the remote electronic monitoring to be out for consultation in regards to the pelagic vessels, and also to add to the existing scallop dredging scheme that's in place already. So as I understand it, as I'm not a specialist in this particular measure, that the consultation is planned to commence shortly on the pelagic fleet. So that hopefully will have a benefit in terms of we can get a range of views from not just from the fishing fleet itself, but also from environmental stakeholders on the value of that. And also it's worth stating that they're across the network of MPAs, we've now got about 37% of Scotland's waters covered by MPAs. So once we do strengthen the monitoring and the policing of these measures, that will provide a significant level of protection for the environment above the Convention on Biological Diversity target of 30%. So we are heading in the right direction. Have we done enough? I suspect possibly not, but that's where, you know, the next Parliament we can look more closely, as Claudia said at the very outset, around the sort of blue economy and blue carbon agenda, as well as protecting vital fish stocks. And I'll not recover the ground that Claudia did, but I would politely again disagree with John Cox and his assessment. Certainly, if you do leave areas untouched by fishing, we do know they recover, and they're fundamentally very biodiverse. You do see actually that being good for fish stocks, because they then have areas where fish are safe to breed, and then repopulate waters that are being actively fished commercially. So it's probably good for commercial fishery in the long run to have protected areas, because then you have young fish can thrive, and commercial stocks can recover.
Thank you. I'll go to Mark Ruskell next. Noting before I do that Angus, who asked the question, has posted in chat that stressing that the question he was really asking was what you would do to bring about proper enforcement of MPAs, not whether they're effective or not. And maybe I've let the conversation stray a bit onto that. So Mark.
Yeah, I made some points to that in my original remarks, but yeah, I mean, I think to go back to electronic vessel monitoring, this is absolutely critical. And you know, Paul, we brought this forward in a debate in the Scottish Parliament back in 2018. Parliament agreed to a widespread rollout of electronic vessel monitoring, not just in the UK fleet, but for foreign boats as well. And to be honest, I've seen a real lack of progress on the Scottish government on this. I mean, the technology exists now to apply this to every level of boat, every size of boat. It doesn't just have to be applied to the pelagic fleet, it can be applied across the entire fleet. I think that's one really practical measure that can be put in place very quickly to police where MPAs are being dredged out and damaged. And I would say to John, it's just disappointing that you know you're not so looking at the science here. I mean, maybe it's because we've got so few no-take zones to show a really the benefit really to the fishing industry of having that recovery within communities. But you know, I think there's good evidence globally to suggest that if you can put in really strict levels of protection, then you get a wider ecological benefit that does have an effect way beyond that no-take zone area, and that can benefit particularly inshore fleets. So looking to bring in a diverse range of seafood products, you know, not just the kind of dredging for langoustines, fishing at the bottom of the food chain as we're doing at the moment, but really bring in a whole range of different products that are there to supply local markets. And I think that's where we've got to look at. We've got to look at combining the ecology and economy together. And we need to do that working with the inshore fisheries sector to do that. But we do need buy-in, and we do need to see enforcement. If there's a fishing boat coming in and it's raiding an MPA illegally, then that's piracy. That's piracy, because it's raiding the public interest. It's taking away and it's stealing the public interest away. And then we need to come down hard on that.